Guys literally only want one thing these days, and it's disgusting. That's right, to talk about financial fair play regulations. It doesn't matter where you go recently, whether it's a family meal, shopping at the supermarket, or attending a conference about the economics of football, the initials on everyone's lips are FFP. What they actually mean, invariably, is Profit and Sustainability Regulations, or PSR if you want to stick with just the initials, but apparently you are pedantic, no fun at parties, and a boring tosspot if you dare to point out their mistake. Honestly, I'm never talking to my granddad about football again. The way he speaks to me is quite frankly a disgrace. Something else that is a disgrace, in a lot of people's eyes at least, are the spending regulations in football, whether that be FFP or PSR, and the punishments that either are or aren't being dished out as a result of teams falling foul of them. Already, some are describing this current Premier League campaign as an asterisk season, based on the fact that Everton and Nottingham Forest have been docked 8 and 4 points each. Leicester City looks set to face a points deduction next season, even if they are promoted, for breaking spending regulations, and Manchester City, having dominated English football in recent years, still have 115 charges hanging over them. Further down the pyramid, Wigan Athletic have been deducted 8 points this season, Reading have faced a 6-point deduction, and both Southend and Torquay United have been stripped of 10 points for entering into administration. It would be fair to say that it's not a great look for the Premier League, or for English football at large, prompting some to ask the deeply worrying question, wait, are we the Italians? Out of this moral abyss, a powerful narrative has emerged. Profit and sustainability regulations exist solely to keep the rich six cartel on top, that is to say, Man City, Man United, Liverpool, Tottenham, Chelsea and Arsenal, and prevent the likes of Newcastle, Aston Villa and Everton from challenging them, and likewise UEFA's FFP exists to protect Europe's elite from any ambitious teams with wealthy owners but less revenue, and they are not only unfair in their nature, having been created with exactly that purpose in mind, but also unfairly administered, as the likes of Everton and Forest are hit with points deductions, whilst Man City, Chelsea and PSG get off scot-free. But to what extent, if at all, is any of that actually true? Well, in today's video, as you've probably guessed, that's what I want to try and figure out. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey from London to Switzerland via New York and Dubai as we take a look at football's various spending regulations, why they exist, what purpose and whose interests they actually serve, and what might be some better alternatives to the current system. UEFA's financial fair play and the Premier League's profit and sustainability regulations were introduced in 2011 and 2013 to little controversy or conversation for about the next 10 years. Yet, all of a sudden, now it is all that anyone wants to talk about, and not only do pundits, journalists and fans all want to talk about it, everyone seems to have incredibly strongly held views about it, the problems with it, and what can be done to fix it. In preparation for this video, I bookmarked a number of tweets relating to PSR, which are illustrative, I think, of the prevailing narrative which appears to have emerged. I'll just read out a few of them. I have protected the people's identities and replaced them with footballers from the clubs that they support, just in case they'd rather their handle and username not be shared. This one, from a Newcastle United fan, and not actually from Paul Dummett, it should be said, reads, quote, "The Premier League are destroying the smaller clubs by not allowing them to compete with the so-called Big Six. You're basically telling the 14 clubs like Newcastle, Villa, West Ham to sell our best players to improve the Big Six. Just scrap this PSR bollocks. Because you're destroying a great brand and also protecting the top six, and don't give a toss about the rest. You're creating a Super League in the Premier League. I can see another Bosman incoming to scrap this pathetic rule. Belgian side Royal Antwerp, I think, are trying to sue UEFA over this rule. Stop this now at Premier League, because you're making yourself a laughingstock. Sad face. Sorry for the rant, folks." End quote. This one, meanwhile, from another Newcastle fan, but not actually Miguel Almiron, quote tweeting in response to the breaking news that Leicester had breached profit and sustainability rules, reads, quote, Leicester City won the Premier League and FA Cup, finished 5th twice and consistently sold their best players for huge profits, yet they still ran afoul of PSR. The system is designed to protect the interests of 6 clubs and punish anyone who comes close to challenging them. End quote. And finally, this one from a Leicester City fan, but not actually Wout Faes, surprisingly, reads, quote, PSR was introduced to prevent another Leicester City happening and protect the Big Six. The richest football club in the world is forced to sell their best players, while Chelsea spaff £1 billion on Moises Cucurella, or whatever his name is, and Man City go unpunished, despite 115 charges. It's blatant corruption by the Red Cartel and their blue buddies, aided by Richard Masters. End quote. That last one was actually an amalgamation of 3 different tweets by Leicester, Everton and Newcastle fans in order to save time, but you get the idea. We might as well start with the initial premise, which pretty much runs through all of them, which is that PSR was introduced to protect the interests of the Big Six or Rich Six, and to prevent anyone else from being able to compete with them. The idea that PSR was brought about to prevent another Leicester from happening, as was stated in that tweet, and as I have seen claimed in several other places, is somewhat undermined, it should be said, by the fact that Leicester won the Premier League title in 2016, under PSR, and 3 years after it had been introduced. But hey, that's only a minor detail. Football fans, and indeed journalists, can often have very short memories. During the 2000s, though the Premier League continued to enjoy enormous economic growth following its founding in 1992, English football was extremely volatile. The collapse of ITV Digital in 2002 spelt disaster for the Football League, with its consequences reverberating throughout the pyramid for at least the next 5 or 6 years. Between 2000 and 2008, an incredible 42 Football League clubs went into administration. That's almost half the teams throughout the entire Football League pyramid. This extended all the way from the likes of Leicester City, who reached 3 League Cup finals in 4 seasons between 1996 and 2000, won 2 of them, and therefore twice competed in the UEFA Cup during that time, but entered into administration and were relegated in 2002, and Leeds United, who won the last First Division title before the breakaway of the Premier League, and were Champions League semi-finalists in 2001, but were relegated in 2004, and entered administration in 2007, dropping down into the 3rd tier for the first time in the history of the club, down to the likes of York City, Port Vale, Notts County and Halifax Town, all of whom entered administration in 2002 alone, and the last of whom were actually liquidated, meaning that the original club at least no longer exists. The Premier League felt fairly immune to most of these shocks. Sure, some of their former clubs had gone bust, but it tended to be after they had been relegated, and often, at least in part, as a result of losing Premier League revenue and failing to make adequate budget adjustments in the immediate aftermath of going down. That was one of the reasons why, ahead of the 2006-07 season, Premier League clubs voted in favour of introducing parachute payments in order to ease the burden of relegation on clubs who dropped down into the Championship to bridge that gap over the next 3 seasons and stave off financial ruin. In 2010, though, Portsmouth happened. Following years of almost unimaginable overspending for a club with the smallest stadium in the division at the time and fairly modest revenue as a result, which was overseen by a series of increasingly incompetent, suspicious and potentially even non-existent owners, Portsmouth entered administration and were docked 9 points, owing a staggering £138 million. Pompey's investment hadn't been secured against loans from an owner who was willing and able to foot the bill, but rather it was owed to players, agents, other clubs for transfers, previous owners, the banks, and about 15 million at least was owed to HMRC. Portsmouth had been in the Premier League for 7 seasons. They had won the FA Cup in 2007-08, represented the Premier League in the UEFA Cup in 2008-09, and reached yet another FA Cup final in 2009-10, the same year in which the club entered administration and was relegated. At this time, UEFA was already actively involved in the process of formulating spending regulations, which would apply to clubs throughout all UEFA competitions. UEFA were concerned about overspending and the future of clubs across the continent, having suffered several casualties since the turn of the millennium, particularly in former Eastern Bloc countries, which were still coming to terms with a new political, economic, and sporting settlement. That was UEFA's stated concern, and it was almost certainly sincere, but their perhaps even greater concern, which they were distinctly quieter about, was the possibility of football clubs becoming permanent loss-making enterprises within football as it existed at the time, basically as a Wild West, with virtually no rules or regulations when it came to spending, which they feared would irritate green-eyed football club owners who would look at the profit-generating sports teams in North America and try to replicate the American model with their own closed-shop breakaway competitions like the NFL or NBA, free of risk and perpetual losses. Of course, those same green-eyed owners, many of them intimately familiar with owning American sports teams themselves, would attempt to do just that regardless, but let's not skip too far ahead. The Premier League had sort of waved away the prospect of implementing financial regulations on its clubs, considering it to be beneath them. Sure, spending regulations might be required for clubs in Hungary or Ukraine, but the Premier League was generating revenue unlike any other league in the history of the sport. Why would it require any regulation when it came to spending? Portsmouth shattered that delusion, but they weren't exactly alone. My own club, Hull City, were relegated alongside Portsmouth in the 2009-10 season, following 2 seasons in the Premier League. Promotion to the Premier League in 2008 via the Championship playoffs was supposed to be a dream come true. Hull was the biggest city in England, up to that point, never to have had a top-flight football team, but following survival on the final day of the 2008-09 season, that dream quickly turned into a nightmare. Overspending by Chairman Paul Duffin and owner Russell Bartlett, again, not secured against themselves, but loans from banks and other private lenders, left the club in £35 million of debt, which they were unable to repay following relegation. Hull and Portsmouth, following what were golden eras for both clubs, were now at serious risk of going out of business and ceasing to exist. Portsmouth entered administration for a second time in 2012, docked 10 points in the Championship, and were ultimately relegated to League Two, the 4th tier of English football, where they spent 4 seasons. Meanwhile, Hull City were rescued by SM Alam, staving off administration, though the Alam family would charge 5% interest on the loan that they made to the club to repay the debt that they inherited, rather than just writing it off. The year after Pompey and Hull, it was Birmingham City, relegated with £30 million debts and serious financial woes, and the following season, it was Bolton Wanderers and Blackburn Rovers, both of whom would be relegated to League One before long, with Blackburn's debt spiralling to in excess of £100 million, and Bolton ultimately entering administration in 2019 and dropping down into League Two in 2020. So the Premier League's hubris had been undermined, and in 2013, 2 years after UEFA, England's top flight introduced spending regulations, which were based loosely on those implemented by UEFA. UEFA, like most other governing bodies, were keen to prevent clubs from going bankrupt, and equally, from escalating losses convincing owners to create their own breakaway leagues, whilst also wanting to preserve the competitiveness of the European rather than the North American model, which was one of the reasons why the initial proposal to just introduce salary caps to control spending and losses was ultimately rejected. UEFA wanted to regulate with a lighter touch than that, encouraging a sustainable business model to prevent the epidemic of crisis clubs and perpetual losses, but without implementing any fixed limits on spending or dictating to clubs where they could and couldn't spend their own revenue. The end result of that compromise was financial fair play, or FFP, which didn't even mandate that clubs in UEFA competitions had to break even, as was initially proposed, just that their losses had to be in moderation and their owners had to prove that they were good for the money. UEFA's FFP, therefore, dictated that clubs could lose no more than €30 million over any 3-year monitoring period. In theory, it capped teams to a €10 million loss each season, but, of course, in reality, a club could make a €100 million loss, but so long as it was sandwiched by 2 seasons of €35 million profits, they would be fine in terms of that constantly evolving 3-year period. Nonetheless, a handful of clubs, fell foul of the new rules. Manchester City accepted a £49 million fine and a transfer cap for breaking the rules in 2014. PSG have been fined multiple times. AC Milan were banned from UEFA competitions in the 2019-20 season due to breaches. Galatasaray also received a ban in the 2016-17 season. And AS Roma and Inter Milan ran into trouble both in 2018 and then again, along with AC Milan and Juventus this time, in 2022. The Premier League's profit and sustainability rules, by contrast, never seem to cause too many problems. The Portsmouth debacle may have shocked the Premier League into action, but the PSR implemented by the Premier League was always much more lenient than the FFP rules, which had already been put in place by UEFA. As a result, for those teams already competing in UEFA competitions, so long as they complied with UEFA regulations, they were never going to have any trouble in terms of PSR. The Premier League followed almost the same model as UEFA in terms of avoiding any fixed limits on specific spending and instead pegging overall spending to revenue, also over a rolling 3-year monitoring period, but the Premier League set their limit at £105 million, so again, in theory, £35 million of allowable losses each season, equivalent to about 4 times as much as those permitted by UEFA. This was for the same reason that the Premier League had been reluctant pre-Portsmouth to implement spending or loss limits at all, because they considered their revenue to be more dependable and only likely to rise, and they trusted their owners to be good for the cash that they were investing in their clubs. It's important to note at this point that when people talk about the Premier League dictating X, Y, or Z, as though the Premier League was some kind of nefarious invisible boogeyman, that when we refer to the Premier League and decisions taken by the Premier League, what we are actually referring to is the 20 Premier League clubs themselves, otherwise known as the league's shareholders, and decisions that have been voted for by at least 2/3 of the teams in the division. That is the way in which all new rules are introduced in the Premier League, and PSR in 2013 was no exception. Everton fans can complain all they like then, and I might have a lot of sympathy with them, and the arguments that some of them might make, as we will come on to, but the reality is that they literally voted in favour of the very same PSR rules which they've now broken in 2013. 13 clubs in total voted in favour of PSR, as it currently stands back in 2013, namely Manchester United, Liverpool, Chelsea, Arsenal, Tottenham, Everton, West Ham, Norwich, Stoke, Newcastle, Sunderland, Wigan and QPR. Only 6 teams voted against the introduction of PSR, namely Fulham, West Brom, Man City, Aston Villa, Swansea City and Southampton. Meanwhile, Reading abstained. Presumably Reading just figured that they were already down and weren't that bothered what the rules were going to be the following season, in a league that they wouldn't be in. In fairness to Nottingham Forest, therefore, unlike Everton, they didn't vote in favour of PSR in 2013 because they weren't in the Premier League, so they didn't have a vote. They are well within their rights then to argue against it and say that they disagree with it, but it doesn't mean that they are allowed to flagrantly disregard it. Forest also weren't in the Premier League when the league's shareholders, or clubs, voted in favour of introducing homegrown player quotas, caps on international players, and rules regarding the number of substitutes that teams can name. But that doesn't give them the right to name a squad without any homegrown players, or make 15 substitutions each week, because, that would be stupid. Even if Nottingham Forest were able to formulate an extremely compelling argument in favour of each team having 12 players instead of 11, and most football fans thought, I think these guys might be onto something with this whole 12 players thing, it wouldn't actually be fair or reasonable for Forest to start fielding 12 players before 2/3 of Premier League clubs had voted in favour of their suggestion, and whilst everyone else was still fielding 11, because, amongst other things, it would give them an unfair competitive advantage. If you want to be pedantic, that analogy doesn't quite work because Premier League clubs couldn't just vote for football to involve teams of 12 instead of 11. That is, a fundamental law change that would have to happen at a much higher level, but the premise is the same. A lot of people seem to have the idea that PSR is some sort of ethereal, extremely complex set of rules, and that breaking them is more of a technicality, and that the powers that be should probably just let it slide. or at least that is a very popular view among fans of clubs who have broken PSR or are at risk of breaking it. The reality is that PSR, more so than FFP in fact, is actually very straightforward. COVID complicated things somewhat, but fundamentally, clubs post their annual accounts, like all companies in the UK. Those accounts show their profits and losses, and if their losses exceed the threshold, then they have broken the rules. Given that these are the sporting parameters which a two-thirds majority of Premier League clubs voted in favour of and ratified 11 years ago, and a two-thirds majority has never since voted to repeal them or replace them with anything else, clubs who break PSR, all of whom know that they are going to breach, Everton and Forest have admitted as much, have cheated, gaining an unfair sporting advantage, which is why the punishment has to be a sporting rather than a financial one. There is also a fundamental misunderstanding, it would seem, of how accounting works, which is maybe understandable. Accounting is, after all, one of the most boring things in the world. When it comes to football, though, fans are obsessed with looking at big transfers or net spend and concluding that they now know everything about a club's finances. Leicester are perhaps the best example of this phenomenon. As I read out in a couple of those tweets at the beginning, and there are literally thousands of others just like them, a lot of people think Leicester have lost a lot of their big players, often for big fees, and therefore, how could they possibly have breached PSR? They are right in one respect. Leicester have raised a lot of money through player sales, over £450 million in total, over the 7 years since they won the Premier League title, with Harry Maguire's £80 million move to Man United, Wesley Fofana's £70 million switch to Chelsea, and Riyad Mahrez's £60 million transfer to Man City being some of their headline departures. That puts Leicester fourth in the Premier League when it comes to revenue generated via player sales during that time. Meanwhile, they have only had the 12th highest expenditure. So their net spend of around £60 million is very modest. I mean, it's significantly less than the likes of Leeds, Burnley and Sheffield United, none of whom have won the FA Cup or had 2 fifth-place finishes during that time. But player trading is just one aspect of a club's finances, and, contrary to popular opinion, it's not even the most important one. Most of a football club's revenue these days, at almost every level of the game, goes on players' salaries. And Leicester, for the last few years, have had a truly gargantuan wage bill. Last season, Leicester's wage bill was £206 million, the highest of any team outside of the Rich Six, above Villa or Newcastle, and putting them within touching distance of Arsenal. Of course, Leicester's revenue is nowhere near that of the Rich Six, which explains about 99% of the reason why they breached and will likely face a points deduction next season. Last season, Leicester's wage bill constituted 116% of their revenue. The Foxes were the only team in the Premier League who spent more than 100% of their revenue on wages alone, with, shock horror, brace yourselves for this one, Nottingham Forest and Everton being the two next highest at 94 and 92%. Tottenham Hotspur, by comparison, as the most extreme example, spent just 46% of their revenue on wages, and that was before the sale of Harry Kane. The end result of Leicester's bloated squad and inflated wage bill was heavy losses, almost £90 million to be specific, the fourth highest in the Premier League. That was after already losing £92 million in 2022, £33 million in 2021, and £67 million in 2020. So, though our minds may go straight to the big money sales that Leicester have made, the club's accounts reveal the reality of their finances in their totality and expose that, as the club, literally in their own accounts admitted, would likely be the case, they have breached PSR by at least £25 million, even allowing for so-called healthy expenditure deductions, according to football finance guru Swiss Ramble. The same is true of Everton. People look at Everton, including some Everton fans themselves, and think, hang on a minute, they haven't spent much on signings in the last few years. And again, they're right. Since the 2020-21 season, Everton have spent less than £200 million on new arrivals, and they have a profitable net spend overall. However, the only reason Everton have spent so little in recent years is because of the sheer madness, the fees they paid, and the contracts that they handed out which preceded it. Between the 15-16 and 19-20 seasons, Everton's net spend was literally double Tottenham, Chelsea and Liverpool's on vastly inferior revenue. The Toffees' wage bill, meanwhile, which peaked at over £180 million in 2021, has been over 80% of their revenue for 5 successive years. That is exorbitant. Again, the end result has been eye-watering losses, specifically £417 million between the 2018-19 and the 2021-22 seasons, which is not just the most of any team in the Premier League, it is almost twice as much as anyone else, which is why Everton's spending has been monitored, and they have required Premier League approval just to make signings over the last few years. Some of you will be thinking to yourselves, alright Alfie, so Leicester, Forest and Everton have clearly overspent and willingly breached PSR, so of course they have to be punished. But what about Manchester City? A big talking point in recent months has been the fact that the cases involving Forest and Everton have been very swift from a guilty verdict being determined to point deductions being imposed, whilst Man City's 115 charges are yet to reach a conclusion. Simply put, that is because they are entirely different cases. Forest and Everton breached PSR loss limits. It is as simple as that. It's written down, literally in black and white. You add up their losses over 3 seasons, it exceeds the limit, therefore they've breached, and then it's just a case of determining a suitable punishment. Forest and Everton can contest the punishment imposed upon them, Forest due to extenuating circumstances of having lower allowable losses in the Championship and them feeling that they needed to strengthen following promotion, and Everton due to the construction of their new stadium, COVID and the war in Ukraine, which is what we are seeing in their appeal processes now as they seek to reduce their points deductions. But they can't actually contest that they broke the rules in of themselves. Manchester City, by contrast, aren't accused of breaching PSR. In fact, last season, they were the single most profitable team in the Premier League, ahead of Brentford, posting profits of £80 million. Following a big loss, £125 million in the 2019-20 season, Manchester City have had 3 straight years of profits, even during the COVID season, which was practically unheard of £5 million, £42 million and £80 million. In theory, therefore, due to the 3-year monitoring period, Manchester City could lose £257 million this season, the most of any team in the Premier League, without breaching PSR. No, what Manchester City are accused of is something altogether much more serious. I have made an entire video about Man City's 115 charges, should you be interested in exploring the issue in a little bit more depth, but the most serious and damning accusation is that the club falsified their accounts for over 10 years, made illicit payments to players and staff in order to keep those costs off their official accounts, and generated illegitimate commercial revenue which wasn't actually paid to them directly by the relevant parties. The charges against Manchester City, if upheld, are tantamount not just to breaching Premier League or UEFA regulations, like other clubs, but of actually breaking the law, potentially with criminal liability for those involved, which is why, in the immediate aftermath of the Premier League charges being made, high-level meetings were held by the UK government and its embassy in Abu Dhabi. The UAE is a geopolitical ally of the UK, despite being an authoritarian dictatorship, and the fact that such significant figures within the UAE could be found responsible for falsifying accounts in order to gain an unfair advantage in one of the UK's largest cultural exports, well, that could be very embarrassing for everyone involved. Manchester City's guilt isn't written in black and white and published in the club's accounts, though. The citizens deny the accusations levelled against them, hence why an investigation is required, unlike in the case of Forest or Everton, before a conclusion can be reached and any punishment carried out. Of course, it could be the case that if Man City have indeed falsified their accounts, for 10 years, as they are alleged to have done, then they did breach PSR and FFP in actual fact, and falsified their accounts to hide the fact that they had done, but at that stage, the PSR breaches really would be the least of their concerns. Man City wouldn't be looking at 6, 8 or 10-point deductions reduced by a point or two subject to appeal. They would be looking, at the very least, at expulsion from the Premier League. No other punishment would even come remotely close to meeting the seriousness of the crime. None of this is to say that people's innate sense that PSR and FFP favours the bigger, more established clubs who currently have higher revenue and can therefore spend more, making it harder for other clubs to compete or catch up with them, is untrue. They are dead right. It's just that it's not a conspiracy. That was always not just a likely outcome, but the express intention of PSR, and 2/3 of Premier League clubs still voted for it, and it was still welcomed by most football fans at the time. Back in 2013, most people thought that it was bad that Chelsea under Abramovich and Man City under the UAE, through the proxy of Sheikh Mansour, had been able to throw unlimited resources at building title-winning squads. Hard as this may be to imagine now, that was viewed as being a bad thing, and there was still popular support in football for restrictions which made buying success in such a transactional manner by states or oligarchs a little bit more difficult. Richard Scudamore, the CEO of the Premier League at the time, literally stated as much in 2013, stating, quote, "A new owner, or even an existing owner with a change in attitude or a change in fortunes, can invest proportionately a decent amount of money to improve their club. But what they aren't going to be doing is throwing hundreds of millions at it in a very short period of time. I'm not criticising that. I've been supportive of them, supportive of what they have done to make it a more competitive league." End quote. Adding that, though he still welcomes super-rich owners and investors, from that point on, their projects were, quote, "going to have to be done in a slightly longer-term way without the huge losses being made." End quote. And that was celebrated as a win for ordinary clubs at the time. Most clubs, meanwhile, knew that without any restrictions, the state and oligarch-owned clubs would always outspend them, forcing them to endure infinite, unsustainable losses in a desperate but ultimately hopeless bid to keep up, which, isn't a particularly attractive prospect if you own a football club and don't have bottomless pockets. That's why 2/3 of clubs voted in favour of PSR, to give themselves a chance of competing and to limit their losses to only tens rather than hundreds of millions of pounds. It wasn't a plot per se by the Rich Six. Heck, Man City voted against it, meanwhile West Ham and Everton literally voted for it, and even if it were a plot by the Rich Six, the other 14 clubs, at any stage over the last 11 years and still now, could overturn or alter it in any way they liked at any time of their choosing. The idea that Richard Scudamore, or subsequently Richard Masters, are these all-powerful puppet masters just doesn't have any basis in fact. I don't particularly object to the term Big Six cartel. These 6 clubs certainly have very close relationships and interests which may be different to the other 14, but they didn't subvert the other 14 when PSR was introduced. Before we finish, it would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that UEFA FFP rules have changed for the first time this season, and there have already been talks with the Premier League's PSR likely to follow suit. The new UEFA rules, known as Squad Cost Control, or SCC, no longer strictly moderate a club's overall profit and loss. Instead, they only tie a club's wages, transfer and agent fees to their revenue, with all other expenditure roughly excluded. Spending on wages, transfer and agent fees will be capped at 70% of revenue from the 2025-26 season onwards, to be implemented in 10% increments season upon season between now and then, starting this season at 90%, so as to give teams time to get their finances in order and prepare for the 70% limit. The €30 million overall loss limit over 3 years, meanwhile, has been doubled to €60 million, and actually trebled for clubs with a positive balance sheet, increasing their allowable losses over a 3-year period to €90 million. So teams in UEFA competitions will be allowed to lose 3 times as much as they were under the previous rules, but effectively with a soft wage transfer and agent cap designed to encourage investment in infrastructure like a club stadium and training ground, academy and youth development, and the rapidly growing women's game, all of which are likely to increase long-term revenue and increase the amount of money that can be spent on wages, transfer, and agent fees down the line as a result. The Premier League is almost certain to replicate this model, but with a higher threshold, just as they copied UEFA, but with more leniency back in 2013. The Premier League's updated PSR is expected to allow teams to spend 85% of their revenue on wages, transfer, and agent fees, so 15% more than UEFA. As has always been the case, but is so often overlooked, UEFA's rules are stricter than the Premier League's. While all of the ire and anger recently has been directed at the Premier League, with PSR accused of preventing challenger teams from being able to compete with the big boys, the reality is that even if they were able to compete and qualify for Europe, if they were in any danger of breaching PSR, then they would undoubtedly massively breach FFP and would be banned from competing in Europe regardless. All of this begs the question, in my eyes at least, that if the aim is for clubs to be more sustainable and to spend within their means, which UEFA's €10 million season loss limit basically mandated, then why do we need oligarchs or state ownership at all? If clubs spend within their means and are self-sufficient, what possible argument could there be against fan ownership or member ownership models and in favour of hedge funds or dictatorships who can't even pump money into the sport getting to own the game instead? Hey, I'm just a guy asking questions. I wanted to end this video by discussing some of the alternatives to PSR and FFP which have been suggested, and my own views as to what would work best, but this video is already rather long. Most of you are probably sick of hearing my voice, and my girlfriend's family are currently having to stay out of the house while I record, which I feel a little bit guilty about. I did cover a lot of the above in my video titled How to Fix Football in 7 Steps, which I will leave a link to in the end screen, but I suppose if this video absolutely kills it, gets 10,000 likes, and there is huge public clamour for a follow-up, I could make a whole video analysing alternative PSR and FFP suggestions, which would work, which wouldn't, why they would or wouldn't, and what I think would be best. Because if there is one thing that we've learnt on this channel in recent years, it is that the powers that be in football wait on my every word and follow out every single one of my instructions. Right, anyway, that is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed, not just to this channel, HITC Sevens, and have notifications turned on, but also my second channel, Alfie Potts Armour, which I am trying to get to 30,000 subscribers before the Euros. That would be great. I would be eternally grateful if you could do that. Both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might fancy watching after this one, including, hopefully, the one that I just mentioned. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads via the username at HITC Sevens on all 3, and all of those links plus a whole lot more should be down in the video description below. Cheers.